Dear students, in this week we are going to discuss the role of UN in addressing the emerging global issues, especially the issue of terrorism and climate change. The UN plays an important role in addressing emerging global issues by serving as a forum for international cooperation, dialogue, and action. Through its various agencies, programs, and initiatives, UN facilitates collaboration, cooperation among member states to tackle pressing challenges such as terrorism and climate change. The UN provides a platform for countries to share knowledge, resources, and best practices, promoting collective efforts to mitigate the impact of these issues on global peace, security, and sustainability. In addition to it, the UN implements frameworks, agreements such as the Paris Agreement on Climate Change and various resolutions addressing terrorism to guide concerted action and promote adherence to international norms and standards. By using its power and promoting multilateral cooperation, the UN contributes to build a safe and sustainable world for present and future generations. Dear students, in today's lecture, we are going to understand the conceptual framework of terrorism. As we all know that today terrorism poses a significant threat to global peace and security. It challenges the fundamental principles upheld by the United Nations. By targeting civilians, by instilling fear and destabilizing societies, terrorism undermines the efforts of the UN to promote peace, human rights, and international cooperation. Dear students, the UN plays an important role in coordinating counterterrorism efforts. It facilitates dialogue between member states and implements strategies to prevent and combat terrorism worldwide. Through resolutions, conventions, and peacekeeping missions, the UN seeks to address the root causes of terrorism. It tries to strengthen counter-terrorism capacities and uphold the principles of justice and rule of law in the fight against this threat to peace. Dear students, before understanding the role of UN in addressing the problem of terrorism, we will try to understand what is terrorism, what are its root causes, and what are its forms, and how this terrorism originated. Dear students, it is important to remember that there is not a universally acceptable definition of terrorism. Various scholars, various experts have contributed to the ongoing discourse which is surrounding around the definition of terrorism. While there is not a universally accepted definition, however, some definitions were given by some scholars. For example, Bruce Hoffman defines terrorism is the deliberate creation and exploitation of fear through violence or the threat of violence in the pursuit of political change. Walter Laqueur says terrorism constitutes the illegitimate use of force to achieve a political objective when innocent people are targeted. David Rappaport says terrorism is a form of political violence characterized by the sub-state, often clandestine use of violence for the purpose of intimidating or coercing a population or government into granting certain political, economic, or social demands. Another scholar, Martha Crenshaw, defines terrorism as a deliberate creation and exploitation of fear through violence or threat of violence in the pursuit of political change. So these definitions were given by different scholars, and these definitions emphasize some common elements in terrorism, like violence or threat of violence. These most definitions of terrorism involve the use or threat of violence to spread fear, to achieve political, ideological, or religious objectives. This violence can be directed against non-combatants or civilians. Second common thing in these definitions is political motivation. Means terrorism often has political aims. It tries to influence government policies, it tries to provoke social change or challenge the existing power structure. Terrorism is also characterized by the deliberate targeting of civilians with the aim of intimidating or coercing a population or government into submission or compliance with the terrorists' demands. While states can engage in acts of violence that may meet the criteria of terrorism, the term is most commonly associated with non state actors, such as terrorist organizations, insurgent groups, or individuals acting outside the authority of a recognized government. Another common thing is in these definitions is indiscriminate targeting. Means terrorist attacks often involve the indiscriminate targeting of civilians, therefore create psychological impact on society by targeting to maximize casualties. Terrorism may also involve the use of tactics that are illegal under international law, such as bombings, assassinations, hijacking, or kidnapping. So, all these tactics are aimed at generating fear and publicity. The perception of what constitutes terrorism can vary based on cultural, political, and ideological perspectives. Acts that one group considers terrorism may be seen as legitimate resistance or self defense by another group. Some definitions also include acts of terrorism which are perpetrated or sponsored by states against their own citizens or against other nations. So it ends the difference line between state and non-state actors. Terrorism also aims to create a climate of fear and insecurity within a society. It disrupts normal life, it undermines trust in institutions, therefore, can erode social cohesion. Dear students, today terrorism is often viewed as a transnational problem, with networks and ideologies transcending national borders and posing challenges to international peace and security. So, dear students, we can say that the definition of terrorism is complex, it is contested. It reflects the diverse perspectives and interests of different stakeholders. Understanding these various interpretations, these various definitions is very crucial in developing effective strategies to prevent, to combat terrorism while upholding human rights and rule of law. Dear students, now we will try to understand the origin of terrorism. The origin of terrorism is deeply associated with the history of human conflict, political upheavals, and ideological movements. While it is challenging to pinpoint a single origin, terrorism has evolved over time. It has adapted to changing socio-political contexts and technological advancements. Now we will try to know the history of origin and evolution of terrorism. Ancient and classical period. The use of terror tactics, including assassinations, intimidation, and violence against civilians or political opponents, can be traced back to ancient civilizations such as ancient Greece, Rome, etc. Groups like the Sicarii, which was a Jewish extremist sect, carried out assassinations of Roman officials and collaborators during the First Jewish Roman War. So it demonstrates early examples of political violence for ideological purposes. Even the medieval period saw the emergence of groups like the assassins in the Middle East, who used targeted killings to advance their political and religious objectives. The Spanish Inquisition and religious conflicts in Europe led to the use of terror tactics by state and religious authorities to suppress dissent. Dear students, the French Revolution marked a significant turning point in the use of terror for political ends. With the reign of terror led by Jacobins, the Committee of Public Safety employed mass executions to suppress counter revolutionary forces. The Irish Republican Brotherhood and Fenian movement in the 19th century employed tactics such as bombings, assassinations in their struggle for Irish independence from British rule. Anarchist wave. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the rise of anarchist movements, which advocate for the overthrow of governments and establishment of a stateless society. Notable events include the assassination of Tsar Alexander II of Russia in 1881 by anarchist terrorists, and the wave of bombings and assassinations carried out by anarchist groups in Europe and United States. The use of terror tactics by anarchists led to the coining of the term propaganda of the deed, which emphasized the symbolic impact of individual acts of violence. Dear students, nationalist movements which seek independence from the colonial rule often use terrorism as a tactic against colonial authorities. For example, the Republican Army in Ireland, the Zionist paramilitary groups in British Mandate Palestine, and anti colonial movements in Africa and Asia. The Cold War era also saw the rise of state sponsored terrorism, with both Western and Eastern Bloc countries supporting proxy groups and insurgencies in conflicts around the world. Ideologically motivated terrorist groups such as Red Army faction in West Germany and the Japanese Red Army emerged during this period. These groups draw inspiration from Marxist-Leninist ideology. In the late 20th century, there was also emergence of transnational jihadist movements such as Al-Qaeda, which sought to wage a global war against perceived Western imperialism and influence. The use of suicide bombings, mass casualty attacks, and propaganda through modern communication channels have characterized contemporary terrorism. The proliferation of extremist ideologies, fueled by factors such as globalization, social media, and geopolitical conflicts, have contributed to the diversification and diffusion of terrorist threats. So, throughout history, terrorism has evolved in response to shifting political, social, and technological landscapes. While the specific motivations, tactics, and actors may vary, the underlying use of violence, and fear to achieve political, ideological, or religious objectives remains a defining characteristic of terrorism across different eras. Dear students, now we will try to understand the different forms of terrorism. As you know, terrorism manifests in various forms, each with distinct motivations, tactics, and actors. Some of its important forms are state sponsored terrorism. State sponsored terrorism refers to acts of terrorism carried out, supported by a government or its intelligence agencies as a mean to achieve political, military, or ideological objectives. So, the motivation may be that states may sponsor terrorism to destabilize rivals, to suppress dissent, to coerce other states, or advance their geopolitical interests. For example, during the Cold War, both the USA and USSR engaged in sponsoring proxy groups and insurgencies in regions of strategic importance such as Afghanistan, Central America, and Africa. Iran has been accused of supporting and funding various terrorist organizations like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Palestine to advance its regional influence and challenge its perceived adversaries like Israel and Saudi Arabia. So, this state sponsored terrorism can escalate conflicts, it can undermine international stability, and hinder diplomatic efforts to resolve disputes. It ends the distinction between state and non state actors, therefore, complicating efforts to hold perpetrators accountable. Another important form of terrorism is religious terrorism. Religious terrorism involves acts of violence perpetrated by individuals or groups motivated by religious beliefs, doctrines, or interpretations. Religious terrorists seek to advance their religious or ideological agenda, often claiming divine justification for their actions. They may target perceived enemies or non believers. For example, Al Qaeda and its affiliates, inspired by radical interpretation of Islam, have carried out numerous attacks targeting non-Muslims, Western interests, and Muslim majority countries which are deemed aligned with the West. The Islamic State also emerged as a jihadist group which seeks to establish a caliphate based on its extremist interpretation of Islam. It perpetrates mass killings, beheadings, and other atrocities in pursuit of its religious and ideological goals. So, this religious terrorism can increase sectarian tensions, it can fuel interfaith conflicts, it can destabilize regions. So, it poses challenges to counterterrorism efforts, as religious ideologies often have deep seated roots and attract widespread support among certain communities. Another important form of terrorism is ideological terrorism. Ideological terrorism involves acts of violence which are driven by specific political, social, or ideological beliefs, or ideologies or grievances. Ideological terrorists seek to challenge or overthrow existing political systems, social norms, or power structures which are perceived as oppressive, corrupt, or unjust. Their actions are often aimed at inspiring revolutionary change. For example, the Red Army faction in West Germany carried out bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations in the 1970s. It aims to overthrow capitalist imperialism and establish a Marxist-Leninist state. Eco-terrorism groups like Earth Liberation Front and Animal Liberation Front have engaged in sabotage, arson, and vandalism to protect environmental destruction, to protect animal cruelty and corporate greed. So, this ideological terrorism challenges the legitimacy of established authorities. It disrupts social order and can increase political polarization. It may attract support from some disenfranchised individuals or marginalized groups which are disillusioned with the mainstream politics. So, dear students, each form of terrorism presents unique challenge for counterterrorism efforts. It requires strong strategies that address the underlying motivations, ideologies, and networks which are driving terrorist activities. Understanding these different forms of terrorism is essential for devising effective preventive measures, promoting international cooperation, and safeguarding international peace and security. Dear students, now we are going to understand the causes of terrorism. The root causes of terrorism lies in the political, social, and economic factors that drive individuals or groups to resort to terrorism. Therefore, understanding the interplay of political, social, and economic factors that drive individuals or groups to resort to terrorism is crucial for understanding the root cause of terrorism. First, we will discuss political factors. In political factors, there are many things which are responsible for the emergence of terrorism, like oppression and marginalization. People who feel marginalized, who feel oppressed by their governments may resort to terrorism as a mean of challenging perceived injustices and seeking political change. Lack of political representation, discrimination, and human rights abuses can fuel feelings of resentment and alienation. For example, the Palestinian Israeli conflict has been a long standing political dispute characterized by territorial disputes, occupation, and denial of Palestinian statehood. Palestinian militant groups like Hamas cite grievances which are emerging from Israeli occupation and the lack of political autonomy as motivations for their acts of terrorism against Israeli civilians and military targets. Another factor within these political factors is ethnic and nationalist struggles. Ethnic or nationalist movements seeking self determination or independence may use terrorism as a tactic to achieve their political goals. Historical grievances, identity conflicts, and territorial disputes often underpin these movements. For example, the Irish Republican Army waged a decades long campaign of terrorism against British rule in Northern Ireland, seeking reunification with the Republic of Ireland. The conflict was rooted in centuries old tensions between Catholics and Protestants, as well as grievances over discrimination and British colonialism. State repression and authoritarianism. Repressive regimes and authoritarian governments may resort to terrorism to maintain power and suppress dissent. State sponsored terrorism, extrajudicial killings, and political repression can increase grievances and fuel radicalization. For example, the Assad regime in Syria has been accused of using state terrorism, including discriminate bombings, chemical attacks, and torture to crush opposition movements and maintain its grip on power. Such tactics have radicalized segments of the population and contribute to the rise of extremist groups like ISIS. Now we are going to discuss social factors, identity and belonging. Individuals who feel marginalized, who feel alienated from mainstream society, may be drawn to terrorist ideologies that offer a sense of belonging and purpose. Radicalization often occurs within social networks, online communities, or peer groups that reinforce extremist beliefs. For example, the online recruitment acts of ISIS targeted vulnerable individuals, particularly those who are dissatisfied with their governments. Social media platforms facilitated the dissemination of extremist propaganda and facilitated radicalization. Economic disparities and injustice. Socioeconomic inequalities, poverty, and lack of economic opportunities can create fertile ground for terrorism by promoting resentment, disillusionment, and despair. Economic grievances may intersect with political or religious motivations. For example, in the regions affected by chronic poverty and underdevelopment, such as parts of sub Saharan Africa, terrorist groups like Boko Haram exploit economic grievances to recruit members and expand their influence. The group's insurgency in Nigeria has been fueled by socio-economic disparities, corruption, and government neglect in the impoverished northeast region. Trauma and social alienation. Traumatic experiences, social isolation, and feelings of disenfranchisement can contribute to radicalization and vulnerability to extremist ideologies. Individuals who have experienced discrimination, violence, or displacement may be susceptible to terrorist recruitment. For example, the radicalization of individuals from immigrant communities in Western countries such as second generation Muslims in Europe is often influenced by experiences of discrimination, cultural alienation, and perceived injustice. Terrorist recruiters exploit feelings of marginalization and identity crisis to recruit these disaffected people into their groups. Economic factors, for example, resource scarcity and conflict. Competition over scarce resources such as land, water, or natural wealth can fuel conflicts and provide fertile ground for terrorist recruitment. Economic grievances may intersect with political or economic or ethnic tensions, can increase social unrest. The conflict in the Democratic Republic of the Congo has been fueled by competition over the country's abundant mineral resources, including coltan, gold, and diamonds. Armed groups, including rebel militias and criminal networks, exploit resource rich areas to fund their operations through illicit trade and extortion, therefore, contribute to instability and violence in the region. Unemployment and underemployment. High levels of unemployment, particularly among young people, can increase susceptibility to radicalization and recruitment by terrorist groups, which are offering financial incentives, social states, or a sense of purpose. For example, high youth unemployment rates in countries like Tunisia and Egypt contributed to the Arab Spring in 2010-2011, which was driven by grievances over corruption, authoritarianism, and lack of economic opportunities. While the uprising initially aimed for democratic reform, it has created also opportunities for extremist groups to exploit social unrest and radicalize the disaffected youth. Economic injustice and corruption. Economic inequality, corruption, and lack of accountability can also erode trust in government institutions and promote grievances that may be exploited by terrorist organizations as recruitment tools. For example, in Afghanistan, widespread corruption, government inefficiency, and lack of economic development have fueled public discontent and weakened the legitimacy of the central government. The Taliban insurgency has capitalized on grievances over corruption, injustice, and poor governance to garner support and recruit fighters from marginalized communities. So, dear students, by examining These political, social, and economic factors which are driving individuals or groups to resort to violence, so we can gain a deeper understanding of the complex root causes of violent extremism or terrorism. Addressing these underlying grievances requires multifaceted approaches, including promoting good governance, socio-economic development, conflict resolution, and countering extremist narratives through education and community engagement. So, dear students, in today's lecture, we have seen that what is terrorism, how it originated, and what are its causes. And we have also seen the various types of terrorism. Thank you.